Okay, and the other bit of housekeeping, as I mentioned earlier, is you can mute your lines with a *6, and then if you have a question later or comment, you can unmute with a *7. And so now that everyone has muted, I will ask again if there's anyone who has joined the call who did not yet say hello, and you can *7 to unmute.
Hi, Cindy. It's Brooke from SDHP.
Hey, Brooke, how are you?
Good.
Good. Okay, let's get going then.
Hi, sorry, I didn't say hello yet. My name's Mark. I'm with Senior Care Network.
Hi, Mark. Good to have you. Anyone else? All right. Well, the first order of business is to talk about funding in D.C., which I was going to say hasn't changed much, but there is a little bit of news to talk about. So, as you probably all know, right now the federal government is operating under a continuing resolution, which means even though the House and Senate had done a lot of work on budget bills and it was looking like some increases for HUD, they did not come to agreement, certainly did not get all of their budget bills done, and besides which there's an election coming, so why should they bother doing the budget on time? They punted till after the election. The continuing resolution runs till December 9th. Now, continuing resolution basically means that you continue with the prior year's funding, which in and of itself is not good for HUD because, as you all know, rents go up, costs go up, utilities go up, and so level funding basically means serving fewer people. The good news is it is a short-term continuing resolution. Hopefully, by December 9th, they will have figured out how to get the budget finalized and get some increases for HUD. But I also wanted to pass along that there's actually a 0.5% across-the-board cut in order to meet budget caps. And so that's definitely not good news. It was for, let me see, yes, so again, across-the-board cut, with the exception of some spending for, I'm sorry, let me back up there. The other item of interest, if you participate in rural housing, USDA program, Section 521 rental assistance, because those expenditures are basically front-loaded at the beginning of the fiscal year, there is permission to spend that amount of money, the necessary amount of money, early in the fiscal year instead of it being prorated over time. So what that means for us is we need to be talking to our congressional delegation, to the senators, to our Congress people. They are or will be shortly home to do campaigning. HUD's not usually financing for affordable homes is usually not a campaign issue, but it needs to be. And keep in mind that no matter what happens in the election, the CR, the continuing resolution, expires December 9th, so this Congress will still be making decisions. They may decide to put it off again, but this Congress has to do something by December 9th. They will be going back into session after the election, and so now really is the time to be talking to them while they're home and before these decisions are made, talking about adequate funding for HUD, basically supporting the Senate numbers that were in the bill that the Senate passed, but talking up your programs, making the connection for them between numbers on a page, which is what they see, and actual work in the communities. I think that particularly with HUD being and USDA rural housing programs being such a small part the budget, it's not something that they focus on. What they do focus on is, do the numbers add up? And these are line items. We need to make sure that they understand that they're not just line items, that this is not money that stays in Washington. This is money that comes into your communities to house your neighbors, to fix up blighted properties, to get people into home ownership, to prevent foreclosures, to rehab houses, all of that good stuff that you all are doing. So, again, now's the time. That's basically where things stand in Washington. If anybody has comments or questions, you may unmute with a *7. Anybody? All right. You've heard this all before, right? It's been a long time since there's been an on-time budget. All right. Let's move on to some state action or activity or bills that are pending in the state legislature. First thing I have on the agenda for today's call is House Bill 1715, the landlord-tenant matter. And let me back up and say that the Pennsylvania legislature is currently on recess, will come back on Monday, on the 17th. There are 3 legislative days scheduled next week and 3 scheduled for the week after. Then they break again for the election. Both the House and the Senate have either 1 or 2 days scheduled after the election. I wouldn't expect much activity to go on, much legislative activity to go on then, unless there's something really pressing. There is talk again about pension reform. They may do what are known as concurrence votes. If a House bill was amended in the Senate, it goes back to the House for concurrence and vice versa. But real legislative activity generally doesn't happen in those few days after the election. It's more ceremonial. It's saying goodbye to colleagues. It's, I believe, election of officers for the coming session. So what that means is 6 days left. And I did hear rumors about the Senate canceling the week of the 25th, but that's not confirmed yet. So they may have 3 days left, but let's say 6. And 6 is the minimum number of days it would take a bill to move through. If it hasn't moved at all yet, it needs 3 days in the House, 3 days in the Senate. But it's highly unlikely at this time of year that anything would move that quickly unless it's a high priority, maybe dealing with the opioid crisis or something like that. So it's important as we talk about various pieces of legislation to understand how far along in the process they are. I want to talk about House Bill 1715 because it has the potential to present problems for many of the people that we work with. It is a bill that would speed up the eviction process after a judgment in eviction. Currently, the tenant has 21 days to move, which is not a lot of time. This would make it 11 days, which is particularly problematic if you have a judgment, say, on the 5th of the month, and you have until the 16th to get out, and even if you find a place to live, most leases start on the 1st, so it's likely to cause problems. 11 days is not a whole lot of time to move, and I have heard it said in the past that, well, the tenant should have known ahead of time they were going to have to move. They shouldn't wait until the hearing or the judgment to start making those plans. It's not always the case. Tenants sometimes have actual legitimate defenses, but the Magistrate District Justice doesn't honor the warranty of habitability or some other defense. And so they wait until they actually get the judgment and then prepare to leave. There are a couple of other problems that we see with this bill. I should have started by saying we really understand that landlording is a difficult business. It's not a high-profit business for most landlords, and most landlords in Pennsylvania actually are small, what we call mom-and-pop owners. They may own 1 or 2 or 3 single-family homes and rent them out, or a duplex. They're not the large owners, although they're certainly there. There are those very small percentage of owners who do make a lot of money by not maintaining their properties, and a part of our concern with speeding up the eviction process is it scares tenants into not complaining about the condition of their properties, their homes. And so in that regard, it helps to contribute to blight and because tenants are afraid to complain. From a legal point of view, this bill is very problematic because it's actually amending a law that was suspended by the state Supreme Court about 20 years ago. Back in the mid-'90s, again, the legislature had tried to speed up the eviction process, doing essentially the same thing. But evictions in Pennsylvania are governed by court rules. That is, how fast, when the district justice hears a case, how much time he or she has to issue a decision, when the sheriff can be called. All of that is laid out in court rules. And the General Assembly, the legislature, does not have the power to tell the courts how to operate. Only the Supreme Court can do that. And so back in the mid-'90s, when the legislature did pass that law, the state Supreme Court suspended it, the language being insofar as inconsistent with court rules. What House Bill 1715 does is it amends a law that was suspended. So it would be very confusing. I'm not sure exactly what that means, what would happen. At any rate, we do see these types of bills every session. So far, well, this particular one, House Bill 1715, just was reported out of the House Urban Affairs Committee, and so it took its first step, had its first reading, what we call first consideration on the floor of the House. As I said before, there are 6 days left. In my experience, it's not likely that a bill is going to be pushed through quickly unless it has a lot of support. I will say that the legislature tends to be supportive of the landlord industry. A number of legislators are landlords. And again, Housing Alliance understands and supports the landlord industry in order to have rental housing. We can't house the people that we work with if there's not a strong rental housing market. But we do have concerns about this bill. So whether it's going to move, hard to say at this point. I would expect if it doesn't, it'll be reintroduced in the new session. This session, we have a 2-year legislative session. It ends November 30th, or for all intents and purposes, October 26th. So I will stop my rambling on House Bill 1715, but open it up for questions or comments. Star 7 to unmute your line.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Usually, if it's HUD-funded housing, it always gives them 30 days after a decision to be out, because then Section 8 or whatever subsidizing that funding is giving that time frame to not only the tenant but the landlord for final payment and all that. Would that still be in effect if this did go through?
Yeah, federal law always takes priority over the state. So
right.
Yes, the process of going to court for eviction, that's governed by state rules. I haven't read the Section 8 rules lately, so if you're saying that it requires 30 days, then yes. And I know that the federal laws require good cause, which state law does not. So yes, the federal rules stay in effect.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Let's see. On a positive note, we have two bills, House Bill 2213, Senate Bill 243, which would increase funding under the Neighborhood Assistance Program, the state tax credit program that supports the work of nonprofit organizations, generally in impoverished neighborhoods. I don't know how many of you have used NAP. It's really a terrific program. I'd like to hear from you in a minute if you have. The program has been around since 1967. It was actually the first in the nation of its kind. And it was authorized at that time at $18 million worth of tax credits. And that $18 million has never changed other than 2 years during the recession when it went down. But it is still at $18 million. And so both of these bills would increase that allocation. The original bill said to $25 million. The House bill has been amended to $36 million. While there's not much time left in the legislative session, again, I was encouraged by two things. One is that the House Finance Committee in August held a hearing on their bill, House Bill 2213, out in Pittsburgh, got tremendous response, and it was at that hearing that the chairman of the committee promised to amend the bill to raise it to $36 million. That happened a couple of weeks ago, and the bill was favorably reported out of committee. I mean, the committee members voted yes and sent it to the floor of the House. So in the Senate, the bill is still in committee. It has not moved, but I was encouraged to see that two of the co-sponsors of the bill are both the Democratic and the Republican chairs of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So I think that indicates that when it does come out of the Finance Committee, it will get some favorable treatment. Again, not much time left. Is there technically enough time for the House bill to move? Yes, or for either of the bills to move? Yes, there is. There does seem to be some momentum. My guess is that this will be on the agenda for next session, but that this is a good time for us to start talking with our legislators about the bill, about the program, about Neighborhood Assistance Program. And that is, I will briefly say for folks who are not familiar with it, that it provides a tax credit anywhere 55% up to 80 or 85% to corporations who pay state taxes. This is on the state tax, who make contributions to nonprofit organizations that are, generally speaking, working in poor neighborhoods to do anything. Housing is certainly one of the activities. Blight remediation. It could be education. It could be crime prevention. It could be job readiness, all sorts of things like that. The contributions are also allowed for food banks, regardless of where they're located. And there is a special priority. There are several special priorities, but including housing for homeless folks that I believe is not limited to impoverished neighborhoods. So let me open the lines. I'd like to hear from anyone who has used the NAP program and take questions if you're not familiar with it. And then, again, really encourage you to talk to your legislators while they're home and let them know the benefits the program has brought to your neighborhood, or if you have not used it, that you would like to. I should also say, in terms of increasing the allocation, that for the past few years, since some changes were made to the law and the value of the tax credits, that DCED, Department of Community and Economic Development, which runs the program, has been oversubscribed. They've been receiving 2 to 3 times the number of applications that they can fund under the $18 million. So, again, *7 to unmute, and has anyone had experience with NAP that you'd like to share? Or questions? Okay. All right. And just a reminder, if you're not talking, you can mute your line with the *6.
Oh.
All right. Let me go on to a few. Actually, people, please make sure that your line is muted with a *6, please, or your phone mute button. Thank you. Let me go on to a few blight bills then. And one we have talked about many times because I've been working on this bill since I came to the Housing Alliance and really hope to get it done this year, maybe with your help. It's House Bill 773. We call it the Clear Title Bill. It provides a procedure for people to gain title to their home when they've been living there a long time, more than 10 years, but don't have title. It often starts, the person moved in as a tenant, landlord-tenant relationship, but the landlord died or disappeared, moved away. No one's collecting rent. And the tenant stays on, tries to maintain the property, but the roof starts leaking. He can't get a home improvement loan or grant because he doesn't have title. He'll end up moving out. You have a vacant property that becomes blighted because the roof is leaking, and you have a title problem because there's no owner to sign off on a deed. So it is both a family stabilization and a home ownership and a blight remediation bill. It has passed the House, as it did for several sessions, and this year I'm happy to say that it came out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Last year it did not, or last session, but in June it came out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and so it is on the Senate floor. Procedurally, it needs to it's had first consideration. It needs to have a second reading, go to Appropriations Committee, and then have a final vote. Excuse me, would people please mute their lines? You can use a *6 to mute your line. Thank you. And the bill has no opposition. It does have the support of the Pennsylvania and Philadelphia Bar Associations because it is a matter of having clear title that can be transferred. The Boroughs Association, the Municipal League support it as a blight prevention bill. So I'd like to take some questions if anyone has questions. And certainly if you know of people who would benefit from this, I would really love to have stories from around the state. So you can *7 to unmute your line.
Good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Oh, no.
Okay, move on. And sounds like somebody was having a side conversation. So if you can mute your lines with a *6, I would appreciate that. We have two bills that would create county optional blight remediation funds. Senate Bill 486 would create a demolition fund if the county commissioners voted to assess up to a $15 fee on the recording of deeds and mortgages. And Senate Bill 482 would create a demolition and rehab fund if the commissioners voted to assess a fee of up to 10% of the sale price of property sold pursuant to one of the tax sale laws. Both of those bills passed the Senate already, and they have been voted out of the House Urban Affairs Committee. So there is a possibility that these will move through in the next 2 weeks. Senate Bill 482, that's the tax sale blight and demolition and rehab fund, needs to have the language tweaked a little bit. There is an amendment prepared to do that on the floor of the House. So that is just a couple of days that these bills need, and this would be a really good time to talk to your state representatives to support Senate Bill 486 and 482, because who doesn't need more money? I'll stop briefly there. Questions or comments about the blight funds? *7 to unmute. And let me go on to House Bill 1437, which is a bill that has been amended to become a bill that creates a system of temporary use and occupancy permits to allow a buyer to get in and make repairs when a property has already been cited for code violations. So the situation that it's trying to address, and this came from the Realtors Association, is they say there are some communities that have pre-sale inspections, which the Housing Alliance advocates for, and in doing those inspections, they come up with a list of repairs that need to be done and require them to be done or an escrow to be placed before allowing settlement to go through, basically because they won't issue a use and occupancy permit until the repairs are done. This creates problems because the seller's not always in a position to make the repairs, and in fact the sale price probably reflects the poor condition of the property. And this is so I would say especially where you have low-value properties and poorer, lower-income homeowners don't have the capacity to make the repairs, but the new buyer takes that on, eyes wide open, because they have the inspection report. And this is not the private inspector that most of us would put into a sales agreement if we were buying a house. This is the municipality's code office coming out and doing a pre-sale inspection. So the bill says you can't hold up settlement. You issue a temporary use permit if the property cannot be inhabited, or use and occupancy, at least allow the buyer to go in and make the repairs. All well and good. There is one provision that the Housing Alliance has concerns with, and that is the provision that says the new buyer shall have at least 12 months to make the repairs. It says 12 months, or the municipality and the buyer can negotiate a longer time. But that 12-month time period may not be shortened. Now, in my mind, it might make sense to give the new buyer 12 months to complete a job, but if part of what needs to happen is fix the bricks that are falling out of the chimney, or get rid of toxic waste that's on the property, or some other nuisance or fire hazard, or even cutting down tall weeds where the rats are living, that doesn't need to wait 12 months. That should be done immediately. So we have been raising this issue, not with the bill as a whole, but with this particular provision. Now, I will say that I've talked to code enforcement people who don't like the whole idea of the bill, because they say settlement is when they have the ability to go in and make sure that things get done. Again, I would wonder whether, in some cases, it would simply be impossible for the seller to get the work done. And as the realtors have said, they've experienced sales have just fallen apart because the seller can't do the work. So our main concern at the Housing Alliance is the ability of local code enforcement to go in after the purchase takes place and say, you need to take care of that chimney within 30 days and not wait a year. This bill is in the Senate, passed the House. It's in the Senate. It came out of the Senate Urban Affairs Committee, so it needs 2 days in the Senate to be passed. And it is pretty much tied up, as my understanding is there's an agreement to move this bill along with those two blight demolition and rehab fund bills in the House. The funding bills were bills that the realtors had opposed, but have now, I think, pulled back on their opposition to let those bills move forward. The idea is that House Bill 1437 would also move forward. So, and I believe it's set on the Senate's calendar for next week, which doesn't always mean that they will actually get to it. But so that bill, again, along with the funding bills, are likely to move. If you have any concerns, this would be a good time to mention it to your state senator. Star 7 to unmute if you have questions about that. Yeah, somebody.
Cindy, this is Ben Hooper. I'm not smart about this bill, but really quickly, under current law, a residential property could sell and have closing in a municipality that does require an inspection without an occupancy permit. Is that right?
It would set up a system of temporary permits so that if the municipality felt that the property is not in good enough condition to issue an occupancy permit, that they would issue a temporary permit so that the owner, the new owner, the buyer, could make the repairs.
No, I understand that. You explained that very clearly. I'm
Sorry.
just wondering, under existing law, could a residential property still sell? Could it go through closing where simply the new purchaser wouldn't be able to occupy it?
Well, my understanding, and I don't have firsthand experience with this, is that in those communities that have these ordinances, in order for settlement to go through, the buyer has to have a use and occupancy permit ready to go. And the municipalities have not been issuing them because of the condition of the properties.
Right. I share the Housing Alliance's concerns, and I'd similarly have concerns that this would be setting up low-income purchasers for failure.
Okay, and so tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking on the purchaser side.
Well, just that purchasers would buy properties that need improvements, but they wouldn't necessarily, everybody has good hopes and intentions going into a real estate purchase, but if the purchaser fell on harder times or whatever, they may lose the ability to occupy it. A, and B, it would allow people to be in substandard housing.
Okay, so you're saying by taking the burden off of the seller, that the buyer may end up with something that they can't handle.
Correct. Not unlike how we see in land installment sales contracts, where essentially the seller finances. There are often there's an expectation that the buyer has to get a loan, outside financing. And a balloon payment's due in a year or two. Often that doesn't happen.
Right. I think that I'd have to really read the ordinances, but my assumption would be that once the buyer has the list of repairs from this is before settlement, has the list of code violations from the code's office. I would hope that the sales agreement would allow them out of the deal if they couldn't do the work, but I'm not sure about that. And you raise a good point. And of course, as you said, some people will go ahead thinking they can do it and not be able to.
That would be my concern. There wouldn't be a requirement that the buyer be able to demonstrate that they have the funds needed to make the property habitable or pass the inspection, essentially.
That's a very good point. I was thinking about it actually from the point of view of a low-income seller who didn't have the repairs, but the buyer would. But it could cut both ways, so you make a good point.
This is Mike McGee with the Pennsylvania Developers Council. I used to be a lobbyist for the realtors, and actually the original statute is something that I had worked on. I'm not 100% familiar with what the realtors and the language in the bill right now, but I think part of the other issue and the intent was you would have municipalities holding up sales for what I would argue were non-substantial violations. You had maybe a hairline crack in the sidewalk that they were going to hold a settlement up for, or a GFI in the sink. While it's a safety issue, they wouldn't let you go to settlement. So the original statute was intended to say, look, there are substantial code violations that could render a property unfit for habitation. If those are real issues that that should prevent a settlement from going through, or at least prevent the buyer from occupying, then those are really the issues you're trying to address. You shouldn't get stuck on non-substantive violations to hold up an agreement of sale when a buyer can go in and put a GFI in after settlement or those types of things. And you'd have code enforcement officers who wouldn't let the sale go through or issue even a temporary UNO. So that was the original intent. I think the statute wasn't very clear on what a substantial code violation was originally, and I think the realtors are trying to clarify that in this bill. Cindy, you're probably more familiar than I am. But that's maybe the perspective I can provide for the call.
Thank you, Mike. I think that's a good perspective, and you're right. The underlying law that's being amended, the current law, is actually very simple, and it does focus on substantial violations. It says that if a buyer buys a property with known substantial violations, they have 18 months to fix it. And originally, the bill simply shortened that time frame to 12 months and had a provision in it that said, or shorter time frame if the municipality is enforcing its own property maintenance code. As I understand the current bill, House Bill 1437, it does define substantial basically as being unfit for human habitation. And that factors into whether you get a temporary use or a temporary use in occupancy. But the bill itself and that the 12 months to do the work and not allow codes to come in and do enforcement, that no longer is limited to substantial violations. That pertains to everything. And so that's where that's problematic for me. Putting aside, Ben raised a good point about potential impact on low-income buyers, but other than that, I can see the value of having the temporary system, but I'm very concerned about not allowing code enforcement to do its work for 12 months. Any other comments or thoughts on this bill? Okay, no, I really appreciate those comments. So, we move on. I have two more bills on the list, and one is, let's keep talking about code enforcement for a minute. This is a bill that's at the very beginning of its journey, and so it's not likely to happen now, but it is House Bill 2239, which creates a code enforcement grant program by assessing a $1 fee on building permits. The money would go into a fund that DCED would administer to, and municipalities would apply for money. I think it's up to 2-year grants to either establish a code enforcement program in the municipality or expand one specifically geared toward blight remediation. So there had been an earlier version of this, a different bill number with a different funding source. It's been rewritten, as I said, a $1 fee on building permits. And it did recently come out of the House Urban Affairs Committee, so that's just the first step in the process. And I'm assuming it'll be reintroduced next year. Any of you who are in municipalities that could use a little extra money to fund code enforcement might want to take a look at House Bill 2239 and talk to your state reps. and I'll take questions or comments on that before I do the last one. *7 to unmute. All right. Keep you posted on that. Finally, the particular interest to those of you in communities with land banks or thinking about a land bank, which if you're not familiar, a land bank, the governmental entity that is responsible for dealing with vacant and abandoned property, sometimes tax delinquent property or property that has come through the tax sale process. And the land bank focuses on acquiring vacant property and getting it back onto market, sometimes doing rehab, sometimes doing demolition, marketing the land, sometimes marketing the property to somebody else who will do the rehab. We now have, I think, 13 land banks, 11. I've forgotten the number off the top of my head. Some are county level, some are city level, some are multi-municipal in where there are smaller cities, smaller municipalities that come together. So what House Bill 1500 originally did was to encourage land banks to utilize property in their inventory to house people who are experiencing homelessness, make it easier to work with nonprofits and other entities that are going to develop housing for homeless folks. The bill was amended to include language that makes transactions, sales, purchases and sales involving land bank property exempt from the realty transfer tax, both the state and local share of the realty transfer tax. In order to, obviously, to save the land banks a little bit of money. Actually, back in early July when the state budget was passed, and along with the budget, there was a bill called that amended the Revenue Code, and since the state share of the realty transfer tax is in the Revenue Code, they were able to amend it at that time to make land bank transactions exempt from the state share, but they couldn't touch the local share at that point, which is governed by a different law to be amended, and so that would happen via House Bill 1500. That bill did pass the House. It is now in the Senate. It has had its first and second readings on the floor of the Senate. It just needs to go through Appropriations Committee and have a final vote, and then back to the House for a concurrence vote. Hopefully that will happen, and again, I encourage you to reach out to your state senators to support the bill. Questions on House Bill 1500 or on land banks? *7. Okay. That, I believe, takes me through my agenda for today. I guess you all know there's an election coming up, and so in November we'll be talking about that somewhat and what impacts that may have on housing. So I would open the lines to all of you if you have, again, questions about anything that we did talk about, or if you have comments, want to share with us something that you're seeing in your area. You can brag about something you're doing, or if you have a problem that maybe other folks in the state would share. I'd like to hear that also. *7 to unmute your line. No? All right. Well, thank you all for getting on. We will talk to you in November, although it occurs to me that, let me see, second Wednesday. Yes, we'll talk to you the second Wednesday in November, which will be right after the election. And enjoy the rest of your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
No.